Russia deploys troops to eastern Ukraine after recognizing the independence of breakaway territories. Vladimir Putin also questioning Ukraine's statehood. Is it a prelude to a wider armed conflict? And what impact will Western sanctions have? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Russian President Vladimir Putin has sent troops into Ukraine. That came after he recognized the independence of two self-declared republics in breakaway regions. The Western countries have accused Moscow of taking a step towards a full-blown invasion. They've begun the process of imposing sanctions. Putin questioned Ukraine's right to sovereignty and said Russian troops will be there for peacekeeping purposes.
I consider it necessary to make a long overdue decision to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. I asked the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation to support this decision and then to ratify the Treaty of Friendship and Mutual Assistance with both republics. It is also essential to understand that Ukraine has never had a tradition for genuine statehood, and since 1991 it has taken the path of mechanical copying of foreign models torn off both from history and from Ukrainian realities. Political and state institutions were constantly reshaped to suit the rapidly formed clans with their selfish interests that had nothing to do with the interests of the people of Ukraine. The whole point of the so-called pro-Western centralized choice of Ukraine's oligarch power was and is not to create the well-being of the people, but to obsequiously provide services to Russia's geopolitical rivals for saving billions of dollars stolen from Ukrainians and hidden by oligarchs in a Western bank account.
And right after the announcement, the Western world began reacting. US President Joe Biden made a statement through Twitter saying, I have signed an executive order to deny Russia the chance to profit from its blatant violations of international law. We are continuing to closely consult with allies and partners, including Ukraine, on next steps. Well, other Western leaders also warned Putin against annexation after his announcement.
If there is annexation, it will be sanctions. And if there is a recognition, I will put the sanctions on the table and the ministers will decide. Keep in mind which is the process of sanctions. According with the treaty, sanctions are being approved by the Foreign Affairs Ministers' Council by unanimity.
This is plainly in breach of international law. It's a violation, a flagrant violation of the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. It is a repudiation of the Minsk process and the Minsk agreements, and I think it's a very ill omen and a very dark sign. And it certainly does not seem to me that it's certainly an indication, yet another indication, that things are moving in the wrong direction in Ukraine. The UK will continue to do everything we can to stand by the people of Ukraine with a very robust package of sanctions, as you know.
What I can tell you and reiterate our position, which that the United Nations fully supports the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, as stated very clearly in relevant General Assembly resolutions. And again, we would encourage everyone involved to refrain from any unilateral decision or unilateral action that could undermine the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and the implementation of the Minsk agreements, I think, is endorsed by the Security Council, and with regards to the status of Donetsk and Luhansk.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us from Moscow in Russia, Pavel Felgenhauer. He's a defense and military analyst with Novaya Gazeta. In Brussels, Theresa Fallon is director at the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. And in Kiev, Peter Zalmayev, he's executive director at the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Welcome to you all. Let me start then with Peter. Is this a prelude to a wider invasion? What's the view from Kiev?
Well, it seems that Vladimir Putin has prepared the ground for that with his decision to recognize the so-called People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk and the essentially unilateral abrogation of the Minsk agreement. He has untied his hands. The puppet states now are claiming that they want to have the rest of the territory, which is still under Ukrainian control, and that is like 2/3 still unoccupied by Putin's henchmen. That means, Russia, through its puppet states, has much further into Ukraine's territory to go. And Vladimir Putin is, if not planning to do that, he's definitely made it very possible for himself in the next few days to try to reconquer that territory and still, retain plausible, as he thinks, deny that he is involved, like what he did with Crimea and the so-called Green Man. This would be a sort of help of solidarity, a kind of a brotherly assistance to the brotherly statelets of Luhansk and Donetsk. He could even try to involve other nations from the former Soviet republics who are members of the collective security treaty organization to make it look like an international peace action by continuing to claim that Ukraine is the one that has been attacking the Donbass.
This is interesting. You mentioned there the Green Men. Pavel, in Moscow, Russia has long been accused of having its soldiers in Donetsk and Lugansk, the so-called Green Men, there without official insignia. Does it make a huge difference now that Russia is recognizing and officially announcing that it's putting troops there?
Oh, yes. I mean, the first time the Green Man appeared, that was in Crimea, because first Russia was saying that these are local people kind of rebelling against the government or the non-government in Kiev. Then, of course, it was said officially that these are Russian troops. And Russia has never up to now acknowledged that there are Russian servicemen in the Donbass, though there was said that these are maybe volunteers who took a recess from active service and went there as volunteers. But now we have a totally different situation. This would be Russian officials, soldiers, though the last reports coming in Moscow are that Russia will not right now move its troops into Donetsk, Lugansk, though there are other reports that it has doing it. But anyways, if the fighting on the line of control continues, even small skirmishes, and if it gets in, the Russian forces get involved actually legally, and if there's going to be reports in the Russian state TV about young Russian soldiers being killed by or wounded by Ukrainians, that's already a prelude for a direct Ukrainian-Russian war that can escalate into an all-out Russian-Ukrainian war, which can further actually escalate into the European war. It's a very slippery slope we are right now on. And of course, Putin has also said yesterday that Ukraine will become NATO member no matter what the Western powers right now say. And so that's also kind of mean, and that sanctions will be imposed anyway. So he was actually digging his heels in and saying that Russia will take action. And now it's clear that how it might happen. Though, of course, maybe that's not happening now, and there's going to be a ceasefire again imposed in the Donbass, but we'll have to see what's happening in the next several days.
I wonder if we're already getting a hint of what you were talking about, Pavel. Let me take this point to Theresa. Was it telling when we heard the Russian president warn that any further aggression, as he put it, from Kiev will cause bloodshed, which Kiev will be responsible for? Is that perhaps an indication of the sort of scenario Pavel was just talking about? Russian casualties could lead to a bigger, wider invasion.
Yes, it is a very serious situation that we're in. The speech yesterday by President Putin, the 65-minute long diatribe, has been, many analysts have said, it's a declaration of war. And so we've seen the Biden administration trying to identify these false flag activities for the last few days. And it seemed that Putin just decided to go ahead with this, even though the idea of 5 Ukrainian soldiers passing into Russia, most people had said that that was just a false flag and an excuse for Russia to take these actions. So I think that they are trying to frame it. They're preparing the Russian public for a possible war, possible people coming home in body bags. And as we know that as they evacuate women and children from the region, the men are staying because they're expected to fight. So I think that with 190,000 troops surrounding Ukraine, I think that it might be more than just declaring Luhansk and Donetsk, sovereign. And the other thing that's a bit unclear right now is that how much of that area, is it just what's occupied now by Russian proxies, or will it be the entire region? And so I think that the Kremlin is almost deliberately keeping that unclear, because at this point, no one really knows. That's the big question mark over everyone. And that will have an effect on the type of sanctions that both the Europeans are willing to impose. And it's interesting to note that as your presentation noted, the UK, which is now Brexited from the rest of Europe, is trying to lead the charge here, and they've already announced sanctions, but the first set of sanctions on 5 banks and 3 Russian people. So I think that they're trying to lead the charge, and the Europeans may be a bit divided on this, but we've also seen a clear message from German Chancellor Scholz that Nord Stream 2 will be suspended, the Russian gas pipeline to Germany.
All right, there's a lot for us to pick up, especially when it comes on sanctions. But before we go down there, I want to ask Peter in Kiev. Peter, I can see you're angling to get in. Let me allow you to get in with a comment before I pose a question to you then.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say, as far as the sanctions, I mean, we'll talk more in depth about it. I did want to mention that it's very notable that the German Chancellor finally, who up till now was reluctant to even name, and allude to Nord Stream 2 by name, finally put his foot where his mouth was and stated unambiguously that Nord Stream 2 has been halted. This is very important. This is a troubling development for Vladimir Putin. Europe, if Europe decides to act as a unified kind of Western front against Vladimir Putin, it's going to make it much more complicated. It's a sort of game of chicken that Vladimir Putin is involved in, where both sides are trying to see who swerves first as they're careening down the highway towards each other.
All right. Let me take then this point to Pavel in Moscow. Putin could have done this step a long time ago, months ago, perhaps even years ago. Is this really part of a careful strategy on the part of the Russian president to slowly turn the heat up on the West? Because his goal is to get his demands met more than getting himself embroiled in a wider invasion of Ukraine. What do you think, Pavel?
Well, it's not really slow. The events began happening last December, and they are developing very swiftly towards a possible world war, actually.
Isn't it slower than if we take what happened with Crimea? That was quite quick. When Putin decides he wants to go in and take a territory, people literally woke up and there Russia was. There wasn't this months of a standoff and demands and meetings and negotiations and back and forth, was there?
Well, I mean, because right now we're, of course, in a different situation than then. And why right now Russia has put the demands so drastically and is kind of demanding that give us what we want or we'll take it by force. Again, that's not totally clear why right now Putin believes that he is so emboldened. He doesn't have the unequivocal support of the Russian population. People are scared of a possible war. He doesn't even have the unequivocal support of the entire Russian elite and of his actually people in the Kremlin and his administration many have apprehensions on what's right now happening. But apparently right now Putin believes that he is in the position to put demands, that maybe it's because of these new hypersonic weapons that Russia has been developing, and he believes that it gives Russia the upper hand and that Russia now is militarily stronger for the time being and should really use this opportunity to push the West and the United States away from its borders, secure a kind of a big buffer zone between itself and the West and NATO.
Okay.
Again, we don't know for sure, but it looks like that.
All right, let me bring Theresa in. Theresa, given that, does diplomacy still have a chance?
I mean, we always must try for diplomacy, but we've seen this diplomats and world leaders beating a path to the Kremlin's door, and pretty much nothing was happening. I mean, even Wallace of the UK said it had a whiff of Munich about it because there was never any de-escalation. That was kind of what was needed for continued dialogue. So the Russians pretended to de-escalate while continuing to escalate and having all of these discussions. We saw President Macron pretty much humiliated because after 5 hours of discussions with Putin, Putin said it was a form of torture, having to talk to Macron for so long.
But let me present to you, of course, the Russian narrative on this, and they would say that's because the West has been wasting time in these negotiations and not observing, as they see it, Russia's security demands and concerns and not addressing them.
Well, they had the meeting at NATO, which was the first time in 2 years that they met at that level, and I think the way that Putin submitted his demands was not a way of having dialogue. He said, sign this. This is what we want. We want this to be a treaty. So there was no discussion, really. There was no dialogue. It was like, take it or leave it. And I think that there were some off-ramps offered to Putin. For example, discussions on troop placement, missile placement, and possibly, nuclear weapons discussions once again to reanimate those discussions. So I think that they did try to offer them off-ramps, but Putin has not accepted that at all. And I think that instead of getting less NATO, the Kremlin's getting more NATO. We're seeing Sweden and Finland watching this very closely. And as we know, they are neutral countries, but maybe if you're not a member of NATO, this is what will happen to you.
All right, let me bring in once again Peter. The message from Kiev has been very clear in the last few days that they wanted stronger sanctions and they wanted them now. What do you think the analysis will be in Kiev of the sanctions which have been imposed so far? Are they enough?
Well, once again, I think the signal from Germany is kind of unexpected because Germany has been considered the odd man out as far as the coordinated Western policy. Putin has been banking on the support of Germany as Russlandverstehers, those who try to understand and sympathize with Russia. So once again, this is probably has thrown a monkey wrench into Vladimir Putin's calculations. As far as Joe Biden's announced sanctions against these statelets, well, this is part of his strategy to still use them as potential, for potential kind of leverage with Russians. They understand that, they don't even reach the level of symbolism that is required. I mean, these republics are already isolated quasi-entities. They don't trade with anyone. These sanctions don't go far. They don't bite. There's an understandable kind of, upset that Ukrainians are feeling over it, but it ain't over till it's over. And Biden has announced that more sanctions are to come. So Ukrainians are, waiting to see. But let me just return to the point earlier about NATO expansion. I just cannot avoid commenting on it. Once again, just to make it clear, the NATO expansion has been a red herring for Vladimir Putin all along. I don't think he's concerned with Ukraine joining NATO. He knows it's not going to happen anytime soon. What he is concerned about is trying to recreate a form of Soviet Union in a different shape or form. He considers the loss of Ukraine a personal tragedy. He wants Ukraine to follow the kind of the trajectory of Belarus next door. Belarus has essentially, over the last year, become a protectorate of Russia under military occupation, and that's exactly what Vladimir Putin is trying to achieve in Ukraine. He wants to dominate it, and he made it clear actually yesterday in his speech. He does not even recognize Ukraine as a legitimate state. He said it as early as 20 years ago in his meeting with George W. Bush. He said, George, Ukraine ain't even a country. And we're seeing 20 years later, we're seeing a very direct kind of result.
There's more for us to pick
thinking.
apart when it comes to go there. I want to bring in once again Pavel. Pavel, the sanctions are still coming in. Take us through what we know about them so far, what sanctions are in place, and what sort of impact do you think Moscow will deem them to have?
What I've seen from Moscow, the sanctions already announced after the recognition of the sovereignty of those Donbas states are rather mild. Mm-hmm. The Russian stock exchange rebounded when they were announced. Especially that neither the big Russian banks like Alpha Banks, Sberbank, VTB Bank are not included. And there's fears that they will be included immediately. And of course, personal pinpoint sanctions are not, Russia's used to them more or less. So these are not yet that serious sanctions at all. And the former president and now Putin's deputy in the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, is saying, they're going to fret, they're going to yell, and then they're going to come to us and negotiate. So we just have to sit it out. Mm-hmm. The same as after we invaded Georgia and recognized the sovereignty of Ossetia and Abkhazia. Right. So right now, I don't think that the announced sanctions are very much a kind of considered as a serious deterrent.
All right, they won't be too worried. Theresa, talking about Putin's latest speech, is it something of a turning point? Up until now, we were hearing the message from Putin and from the foreign minister that, hey, we don't want to invade, there is no invasion, this is all hysteria. And in the latest speech, it sounded like Putin was questioning the very right of Ukraine to exist as an independent country.
Yes, I think it is extremely worrying, this message. We're not seeing upholding, as the UN states, sovereignty issues are being, he's not invading because it's not a sovereign country. That's his narrative. And that many historians, for example, Tim Snyder of Yale University, says that this is Putin's fantasy from 1,000 years ago, fairy tale. So the fact that he is pretending it is not a country and therefore can be absorbed by Russia, I think is an extremely worrying narrative. And this is to kind of prep the Russian population about this. They're kind of reabsorbing their cousins. But I think that what many analysts have stated, that they will want to have regime change. They just need a leadership that will be more pro-Russia rather than
Let me play devil's
pro-Western.
advocate again, if you permit me, Theresa, and present the perspective that, on the other side would argue that this is exactly what all world powers have done, including the US with countries like Cuba in their backyard, that they want their spheres of influences.
Well, of course, it's hard to tell people in 2022 you can only be a buffer state. And that's what Russia wants. They want Ukraine to be one giant buffer state. And I think that it is clear that there will be no boots put on the ground by any Western power in Ukraine. That has been made absolutely clear. And I think that Putin has made his calculations that they have weatherproofed themselves for the last 7 years with Fortress Russia, this idea of becoming less dependent on the West, having other financial instruments. They only use 16% of their exchanges are in dollars now, so that's a big decline from 40% several years ago. So I think that they have been working and preparing on this. And let's not forget the big difference between now and what happened in Crimea back in 2014 is that they have the tacit support of Beijing. We saw Putin go to Beijing,
right,
sign this agreement with President Xi, and so they have this understanding
they have
that even if the West has sanctions.
Yeah, from Beijing. All right,
Yes.
I'm afraid we are running out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. It's been a great discussion. Let's thank our guests, Pavel Felgenhauer, Theresa Fallon, and Peter Zalmayev. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.